Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with the life of Isabella Bird. She was a traveler, an explorer, a writer, and someone who spent much of her life going to places that most people in her time would never have dreamed of visiting. She lived in the 19th century, in an era when the world was still full of places that felt truly far away, when a journey could take weeks or months, when letters were the only way to stay in touch with the people you loved, when maps still had blank spaces in them. And into that world, Isabella was born, quietly, gently, the daughter of a country clergyman in the north of England. Her life, from the outside, might have looked like it was heading somewhere very ordinary. A quiet upbringing, a modest household, the expectations that came with being a woman in Victorian England. But Isabella had something in her that kept pulling her outward, something that wouldn't settle. And over the course of her long life, she would travel to places as far apart as the Hawaiian Islands and the mountains of Japan, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, and the interior of China, the highlands of Tibet, and the plains of Morocco. She wrote about all of it, in long, careful letters, in books that people read with great interest and a certain quiet amazement. She became, eventually, one of the first women to be elected a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a remarkable thing for someone who had started life as a vicar's daughter in a small English village, with a bad back and a constitution that was often described as delicate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin at the beginning. Isabella Lucy Bird was born on the 15th of October in 1831. She came into the world in a village called Boroughbridge in the county of Yorkshire, in the north of England. Her father was Edward Bird, an Anglican clergyman, a thoughtful man by all accounts, someone who took his faith seriously and also had a genuine love of learning and of the natural world. Her mother was Dora Lawson. She came from a family that placed a strong value on education, which was not always a given for women of that time. Dora was a woman of quiet intelligence and steady character. Isabella was the eldest child. She would later have a younger sister named Henrietta, who would become one of the most important people in her life. The two sisters were very close throughout their lives. They were different in temperament in some ways, but they shared a deep bond that would last until Henrietta's death, many decades later. The family moved several times during Isabella's childhood. Her father's work as a clergyman took them to different parishes. They lived for a time in Cheshire, in the northwest of England, and then later in Birmingham, the large industrial city in the English Midlands. These moves shaped Isabella in small ways. She grew up knowing that places were not permanent, that life could shift and change and take you somewhere new. Her childhood health was not strong. This is something that comes up again and again in any account of Isabella's early life. She suffered from a spinal complaint. The exact nature of it isn't entirely clear from historical records, but it caused her real discomfort. It was serious enough that at one point, when she was around 18, she underwent a surgical procedure to address it. A small fibrous tumor was removed from near her spine. The recovery was slow. Her doctors and her father began to think that what she needed was a change of air, a change of scene. This was a common prescription in Victorian medicine, the idea that travel and fresh air and new surroundings could restore a person's health. It sounds simple, perhaps even a little vague, but for Isabella, it would turn out to be the beginning of everything. Her father arranged for her to travel to North America. She would visit relatives in Canada. She would see something of the wider world. She was 22 years old when she sailed. The voyage itself was not particularly comfortable. Ocean crossings in the mid-19th century were long and often rough. Steamships existed, but they were not yet the dominant form of ocean travel. Conditions could be basic. The sea could be unkind. But Isabella was curious. She observed everything around her with attention. She had always been a reader, and she had a natural habit of noticing things, of taking in the details of the world around her. The other passengers, the crew, the quality of the light on the water, the way the ship moved through different kinds of weather. When she arrived in North America, she spent several months traveling. She visited Nova Scotia. She traveled through parts of what is now eastern Canada. She crossed into the United States and spent time in New England. She saw cities and countryside. She met all kinds of people, and she wrote about it. Careful, detailed letters home to her family, to her father, and to Henrietta. Those letters were so vivid, so well observed, so quietly engaging, that when she returned to England and her father read them all together, he encouraged her to turn them into a book. She did. The book was published in 1856, when Isabella was 24 years old. It was called The Englishwoman in America. It was modest in tone, observant and honest. It didn't make grand claims or dramatic statements. It simply described what she had seen and experienced in the clear and careful voice that would become her signature. The book was well received. People liked it. And for Isabella, there was something important in the making of it. She had found a way to do two things she loved at once: to travel and to write. Her health, as her doctors had hoped, had also improved somewhat during the North American journey. She felt better outdoors. She felt better when she was moving. The open air agreed with her. The activity agreed with her. But back in England, the old complaints tended to return. The back pain, the general sense of not being quite well. The Victorian household, with its indoor life and its social expectations, didn't suit her in the way that the open road did. This pattern would repeat itself throughout her life. At home in England, she would often be unwell, sometimes significantly so. But the moment she set out on a journey, something in her seemed to come alive. The ailments would recede. The energy would return. It was as if the world itself was her medicine. After the publication of her first book, Isabella spent several years living the relatively ordinary life that her situation and her time expected of her. Her father died in 1858. This was a significant loss. She had been close to him, and his death left a quiet gap in her life. She and her mother and Henrietta settled in Edinburgh, the Scottish capital. It was a city Isabella would always have a complicated relationship with. She appreciated its culture, its intellectual life, its beauty in certain lights. But she never felt entirely at home there. The cold dampness of the Scottish climate didn't help her health. The social world of a respectable Victorian household felt, over time, like a gentle kind of constraint. She wrote a second book during this period. It was about the Scottish Highlands and Islands, drawn from travels closer to home. It was a quieter book than the first, reflective, careful, but Isabella was restless, and the restlessness was not simply temperamental. It had a physical dimension too. When she didn't travel, she didn't feel well. Her doctors, again, recommended a change of scene. And so, in the early 1870s, Isabella began to plan something more ambitious than anything she had done before. She was in her early 40s now, not young by the standards of her time, but not old either. And something in her was ready for a larger journey. She decided to go to Australia and New Zealand, and then, perhaps on to America. She sailed in 1872, and what happened on that journey would change everything. The voyage out to Australia was long in the way that ocean journeys in that era simply were, days blurring into other days. The slow rhythm of the ship, the changing quality of the sky as the latitude shifted, the gradual warming of the air as they moved south and then further south still. Isabella observed it all. She always did. She had that quality of attention that made even the quieter moments of travel feel worthwhile. She noticed the color of the water. She noticed the other passengers and the small dramas of shipboard life. She noticed the way her own body felt in the open air, away from the enclosed world of the Edinburgh drawing room. She spent time in Australia and New Zealand. Both places interested her. She moved through them with her characteristic mixture of curiosity and practicality. She was not a tourist in the way that word is sometimes understood. She didn't simply observe from a comfortable distance. She wanted to get into things, to understand how places actually worked, to talk to ordinary people, not just the respectable ones. But it was not Australia or New Zealand that would define this journey. It was what came next. On her way back toward England, she stopped in the Hawaiian Islands. They were known at that time by another name, the Sandwich Islands, as they had been called since the voyages of Captain Cook nearly a century before. They sat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far from almost everything, warm and green and surrounded by deep blue water. Isabella had not planned to stay long. She stayed for 6 months. Something happened to Isabella in Hawaii. Something quiet but real. She arrived feeling, as she often did after a long voyage, somewhat worn. The fatigue of travel, the lingering complaints that never entirely left her. But almost immediately, the islands began to work on her in a way she hadn't expected. The climate was gentle, warm without being oppressive. The air was soft and carried the smell of flowers and salt, and something harder to name. The landscape was extraordinary. Volcanic mountains rising from the sea, valleys of extraordinary green, waterfalls dropping through forests of unfamiliar trees. And the people were, in Isabella's account, generous and easy in their manner. The native Hawaiian culture, though already under significant pressure from outside contact by this point in the century, still had a warmth and openness that affected her deeply. She began to write. This matters, because it was in Hawaii that Isabella discovered what would become one of the defining pleasures of her traveling life. She had ridden horses before, of course, but in Hawaii, she began to ride in a different way. Long rides into the interior of the islands, up into the hills, through forests, along the edges of volcanic craters. She rode astride, rather than side saddle. This was considered quite improper for a woman of her background and time. The side saddle was the respectable way for a Victorian lady to sit on a horse. It was safer looking, more decorous, more in keeping with what was expected. But it was also far less practical for the kind of riding Isabella now wanted to do. Rough terrain, long distances, steep and uncertain paths. So she rode astride, and she found it immeasurably better. And she didn't much worry about what people thought. This small detail tells you something about Isabella. She had a deep respect for the conventions of her world. She was not, at heart, a rebel. She was in many ways a thoroughly Victorian woman, but when a convention got in the way of actually doing something well, she was quite capable of setting it aside and getting on with things. She wrote about Hawaii in the long, detailed letters she sent home to Henrietta. The letters described everything: the rides, the landscape, the people she met, the volcanic craters she looked into, the way the islands felt different from anything she'd encountered before. She was happy there, genuinely, quietly happy, and it showed in the writing. From Hawaii, Isabella eventually made her way to the mainland of North America. She arrived on the western coast, in California, in the autumn of 1873. She was in her early 40s. She was alone, and she was about to do something that even by her own expanding standards was quite remarkable. She decided to go to Colorado. Colorado in 1873 was not the settled, easily traveled place it would later become. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed just a few years earlier, which made the basic journey possible in a way it hadn't been before. But Colorado itself was still a rough and largely unsettled territory. The towns were young. The landscape was enormous. The winters were serious. Isabella took the train east and then south, watching the landscape change around her. The flatness of the Great Plains, the gradual rising of the land as the mountains approached, the first sight of the Rocky Mountains themselves, enormous and snow-covered, rising against the sky. She made her way to the small settlement of Estes Park, high in the mountains. It was barely a settlement at all, really. A few cabins, a handful of people making lives in a wild and beautiful place. She stayed for several months, and in Estes Park, something happened that was both wonderful and complicated. She met a man named Jim Nugent. Jim Nugent was known in the area as Mountain Jim. He was a trapper and hunter who lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the wilderness. He was, by most accounts, a striking figure, tall and strongly built, with a face that had been partially disfigured by a bear attack, which had left him with significant scarring on one side. He was also, by many accounts, something of a contradiction. He could be charming and well-read. He clearly had some education. He could quote poetry. He could be thoughtful and gentle in conversation. And he could also be rough and unpredictable. He drank heavily at times. He had a reputation for a volatile temper. Isabella wrote about him with careful honesty. She described him as the most complex person she had encountered on her travels. She was clearly drawn to him, and he, by all accounts, was drawn to her. It would be wrong to overstate this. Isabella herself was careful not to. But there was something between them, a genuine connection, a friendship that had warmth in it, and perhaps something more than friendship. Though Isabella never spelled that out in plain terms, he guided her through the mountains. He took her on rides through territory she could not have navigated alone. He showed her the landscape from angles and distances she wouldn't have found by herself. And one of those journeys led her to the summit of Long's Peak. Long's Peak is one of the highest mountains in Colorado. It rises to over 14,000 feet. The climb is serious even now, with modern equipment and well-marked trails. In 1873, it was a genuine undertaking. Isabella climbed it. She described the climb in her letters with the same clear, steady voice she brought to everything. The effort of it, the cold, the technical difficulty of certain sections, the moments when she needed help, which she accepted without embarrassment, and the view from the top, which she described with quiet awe. She had climbed a mountain in the Rocky Mountains, alone, except for a guide who was himself a complicated and fascinating figure. In her early 40s, with a bad back, it is the kind of thing that stops you when you read about it. Even now, even knowing what else she would go on to do. The months in Colorado gave Isabella material for what would become one of her most beloved books. She returned to England in 1874 and began to work the letters into a narrative. The book was published in 1879 and was called A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains. It was dedicated to her sister, Henrietta. The book captured something real about the Colorado landscape and the life being lived there at that particular moment. Isabella wrote about the mountains with affection and precision. She wrote about the people she had met with fairness and humanity. She wrote about her own experiences without false modesty, but also without exaggeration. The book was warmly received, more than warmly. It established Isabella as a significant travel writer, not just an interesting curiosity, but someone with a genuine voice and a genuine eye. There was one shadow over the period following her return. Jim Nugent was dead. He had been shot and killed in a dispute not long after Isabella left Colorado. The details were murky and disputed at the time. They remain somewhat unclear. But he was gone. And Isabella, reading the news in Edinburgh, felt it. She mourned him in her quiet way. She didn't write about it extensively or dramatically. But the loss was real. She carried it with her. After Hawaii and Colorado, Isabella was a different person in some ways. Or perhaps more accurately, she had become more fully herself. She had seen what she was capable of. She had learned what the traveling life did for her. Not just her spirits, but her actual physical health. And she was not finished. Not nearly. The late 1870s were a period of relative stillness for her. She was in Edinburgh. She was writing. She was unwell, on and off, as she tended to be when she was at home. She cared for her sister Henrietta, who had her own health difficulties. The two women lived quietly together, corresponding with the world, reading, maintaining the life that respectable Victorian women were expected to maintain. But Isabella's mind was always reaching outward, toward the next place, toward the parts of the world she hadn't yet seen. And in 1878, she set out again. This time, she was going to Japan. Japan in 1878 was a country in the middle of a remarkable transformation. Just a decade earlier, the country had been largely closed to the outside world. For more than 2 centuries, Japan had maintained a strict policy of isolation. Foreign trade was limited. Foreign visitors were rare. The country had developed along its own lines, in its own way, largely separate from the currents that were reshaping the rest of the world. But in the 1850s, American naval pressure had forced Japan to open its ports. And in 1868, a dramatic political change, known as the Meiji Restoration, had brought a new government to power. a government that was determined to modernize the country, to bring in Western technology and Western ideas, to transform Japan into a nation that could hold its own in a world increasingly dominated by European powers. When Isabella arrived, this transformation was well underway. The cities were changing rapidly. Western dress was appearing alongside traditional clothing. New industries were starting up. Railways were being built. The old feudal order was dissolving, and something new was taking its place. It was a fascinating moment to arrive. And Isabella, as always, was paying close attention. She landed at Yokohama, the port city near Tokyo that served as the main point of entry for foreign visitors. It was already a busy, somewhat international place. There were foreign merchants and diplomats. There were Western-style buildings alongside traditional Japanese ones. There was a sense of two worlds existing in the same space. Not always comfortably, Isabella spent a little time in Yokohama and in Tokyo. She visited temples. She observed the life of the streets with her usual attentiveness. She formed impressions and recorded them carefully. But she didn't want to stay in the cities. She never really did. What she wanted was to go into the interior, into the parts of Japan that foreign visitors rarely reached, into the countryside and the mountains, into the Japan that existed away from the ports and the modernizing cities, where life was still being lived in older and quieter ways. And so she hired a guide and interpreter, a young man named Ito, and she set out northward. Ito was an interesting figure in Isabella's Japanese journey. He was young, perhaps 18 or 19 years old. His English was serviceable if imperfect. He was sometimes unreliable. He had a fondness for spending money that occasionally caused friction. But he was also resourceful and good-humored, and he made the journey possible in practical ways that Isabella freely acknowledged. She wrote about him with a mixture of mild exasperation and genuine affection. He was, in some ways, the human texture of the Japanese journey. Not a friend, exactly, in the way that Western travelers sometimes imagine their guides to be, but a presence, a companion on the road. They traveled north through the main island of Honshu, moving away from the familiar coastline and into landscapes that became gradually wilder and more remote. The roads were not roads in any sense that a Victorian English traveller would have recognised. They were paths, often narrow and rough, sometimes barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. They could be muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry weather, and treacherous in either. Isabella travelled on horseback for much of the journey. The horses in rural Japan at that time were small animals, sturdy but not large. Isabella, even at average height, found that her feet sometimes nearly brushed the ground. She also travelled by a kind of palanquin called a keigo, which was a basic form of sedan chair carried on a pole by bearers. It was not particularly comfortable. The motion was uneven and sometimes nauseating, but it was the way things were done in the rural interior, and Isabella adapted to it with her usual practicality. The landscape she moved through was extraordinary. Green hills folding into one another, rice paddies in the valleys, the water catching the light, small villages of wooden houses with deep-eaved roofs, streams running clear and fast through rocky channels, mountains appearing and disappearing in the distance as the path wound on. She found it beautiful. That comes through clearly in her writing, not in an exclamatory way. She wasn't given to exclamations. But the beauty of the Japanese countryside settled into her prose in a steady, quiet way, the way landscape settles into someone who is genuinely paying attention to it. The villages she passed through were not accustomed to foreign visitors. In some places, particularly the more remote ones, Isabella was a genuine curiosity. People came out to look. Children gathered and stared. Adults observed with expressions ranging from open curiosity to something closer to wariness. She was a foreign woman, traveling alone, apart from her young interpreter, dressed differently, looking different, moving through spaces where such a person had simply never been before. She described these encounters without self-importance. She didn't dramatize the strangeness of her presence or use it to make herself the hero of the story. She simply recorded what happened. The looks, the occasional hostility, the more frequent curiosity, the moments of unexpected warmth and hospitality, because there were those too. She stayed in local inns, called yadoyas, along the route. These were basic establishments, simple, and often quite small. The rooms were sparse by any standard. Walls of paper and wood, sleeping on the floor, on a mat, shared facilities. The smell of unfamiliar food, sounds she couldn't always identify in the dark. She found it difficult at times. She was honest about that. The lack of privacy, the insects, the heat of the summer months, the food which was not always to her taste, the sheer physical effort of the journey, day after day on rough roads. But she also found it absorbing. The intimacy of staying in small local inns gave her access to ordinary Japanese life in a way that the hotels of Yokohama never could have. She saw families in their daily routines. She watched the rhythms of rural communities. She noticed things that a visitor staying only in the cities would never have seen. One of the most striking episodes of her Japanese journey came when she reached the northern island of Hokkaido. Hokkaido was at that time a frontier region. Japan had only relatively recently begun to assert full control over the island. Its indigenous people, the Ainu, still lived there in significant numbers, maintaining many of their traditional ways of life, even as the Japanese government was beginning to push policies that would gradually erode those ways. Isabella spent time with an Ainu community. She described them with genuine respect and careful observation. She was struck by their appearance, which was quite distinct from the Japanese people she had been traveling among. The Ainu men had full beards, unusual in Japan. The women had traditional tattoos around their mouths and on their hands. She described their homes and their customs and their manner toward her. She found them warm. She ate with them and sat with them and tried to understand something of their lives. It was the kind of encounter that her era didn't always handle well. Victorian travelers often described indigenous peoples in ways that reflected the prejudices and assumptions of their time. Isabella was not entirely free of those assumptions. She was a woman of her era, and that shows in her writing and in places. But she was also genuinely curious in a way that went beyond simple classification. She wanted to understand. She wanted to see people as people. And that quality of attention, even when imperfect, gave her accounts a humanity that not all Victorian travel writing possessed. She returned from Japan in 1879, carrying notebooks full of observations and a head full of images and impressions. The letters she had sent home to Henrietta during the journey were once again vivid enough to form the basis of a book. She worked on it through the late months of 1879 and into 1880. The book was called Unbeaten Tracks in Japan. It was published in 1880, and it was received with considerable interest. The title was well chosen. She had genuinely gone to places that other Western travelers hadn't reached. She had seen a Japan that was not the Japan of the treaty ports and the tourist routes, and she wrote about it with the authority of someone who had actually been there, on the ground, on horseback, in small rural inns, in an Ainu community on a northern frontier island. The book added to her growing reputation. She was becoming known, not famous in a loud way, but recognized, read, respected by people who took travel writing seriously, which in that era included a great many people. And she was not done traveling, but before the next journey, something happened at home that changed her life in a quieter and more private way. Her sister Henrietta had not been well for some time. This is something Isabella had been aware of and had worried about during her travels. The letters she sent home were always partly for Henrietta. The two sisters maintained their correspondence with devotion. Isabella's books were shaped partly by those letters, but also shaped by the imagined presence of her sister as reader, the person she was writing to, in some fundamental sense. Henrietta's health had been declining through the late 1870s. The nature of her illness isn't entirely clear from the historical record, but it was serious, and it was getting worse. Isabella was home in Edinburgh, caring for her sister, writing, living the indoor domestic life that never suited her, but that she accepted without complaint when it was what was needed. And it was during this period at home that she met a man named John Bishop. John Bishop was a physician, a quiet, serious, intelligent man. He had become the family's doctor. He had been attending Henrietta during her illness. He was, by all accounts, a kind and thoughtful person, not glamorous, not adventurous in any obvious way, but steady and genuine. He fell in love with Isabella, and Isabella, who had never married, who had spent much of her adult life moving through the world alone and apparently content in that solitude, found herself in an unexpected position. She was in her late 40s now. John Bishop was younger than her by some years. This was noticed and commented upon in the way that such things were always noticed and commented upon in Victorian society. But Bishop was serious in his intentions and clear about his feelings. Isabella took her time. She did not rush toward the decision, and it was partly, perhaps largely, because of Henrietta. While her sister was ill, everything else felt secondary. Henrietta came first. Isabella devoted herself to her sister's care with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. Henrietta died in 1880. It was a significant loss, perhaps the most significant of Isabella's life. The two women had been companions and confidants for decades. The correspondence between them had been the thread running through all of Isabella's travels. The imagined presence of her sister had shaped the way she saw and described the world. Now that presence was gone. Isabella grieved quietly. She didn't make a public display of her sorrow. That wasn't her way. But the loss was deep, and it showed in the stillness that followed. And then, a year after Henrietta's death, Isabella married John Bishop. The marriage took place in 1881. She was 49 years old. It was, by most accounts, a calm and companionable marriage. Not a passionate romance in the obvious sense, but a genuine partnership between two thoughtful people who respected each other. Isabella did not travel during the early years of her marriage. She was in Edinburgh. She was being a wife. She was engaging with the social and intellectual life of the city in a more settled way than she ever had before. But her health, predictably, was not good. The familiar pattern reasserted itself. At home, indoors, in the Scottish climate, Isabella did not thrive. The back pain returned. Other complaints appeared. She was not well. John Bishop understood this about her. He had seen it. He knew that travel was, in some genuine sense, medicinal for her. He did not hold her back, but for the moment, she stayed. And then, in 1886, John Bishop died. He had been ill for some time. His death was not entirely unexpected, but it left Isabella widowed, in her mid-50s, in Edinburgh, alone in a way she had not been for several years. She grieved for him, genuinely. The marriage had been real, and the loss was real. And then, after a period of mourning, she began to make plans. She was going to India. India, in the late 1880s, was the heart of the British Empire, in a way that no other place quite was. It was vast, enormously, almost incomprehensibly vast. A subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people, dozens of languages, ancient civilizations layered one upon another, going back thousands of years. A place of extraordinary variety, where the landscape shifted from tropical coastline to high desert, to the greatest mountain range on Earth, sometime within the span of a single journey. And over all of it, the British presence, the colonial administration, the army, the railways, which the British had built and which now threaded across the subcontinent in long, straight lines, connecting cities that had once been separated by weeks of difficult travel. The civil servants and their families, the merchants, the missionaries, the whole vast machinery of empire, sitting on top of a civilization that had existed long before any European had set foot on the subcontinent and would exist long after. Isabella arrived in 1889. She was 57 years old. She had come partly for the travel, but she had also come with a purpose beyond simple exploration. In the years since John Bishop's death, she had become increasingly interested in medical mission work, the idea of bringing medical care to people who had little or no access to it. She had been involved in supporting such efforts at home in Scotland, and she wanted to see the work firsthand, to understand it, to write about it in a way that might help others understand it too. She travelled through the northwest of India, through the Punjab, the broad, fertile plain in the north of the subcontinent, through the hill regions near the border of what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. She visited mission hospitals. She talked to doctors and nurses. She observed the work being done and the conditions in which it was being done. She was moved by it. The need was enormous. The resources were thin. The people doing the work were, in many cases, giving their entire lives to it, in circumstances that were genuinely difficult. She wrote about it with her usual clarity, not sentimentally, not with the kind of improving rhetoric that Victorian missionary writing sometimes fell into, but honestly and directly, in a way that conveyed the reality of what she had seen. But India was only the beginning of this particular journey. From India, Isabella moved on, eastward and northward, into territory that even by her standards was remote and difficult. She was going to the Himalayas, into the high mountain regions that sat on the edges of the Indian subcontinent, into places where the altitude made breathing difficult and the cold was serious, even in summer, into landscapes that made even the Rocky Mountains feel, in comparison, almost intimate. She crossed into the region of Ladakh, the high desert plateau that sits in the far north of what is now India, bordered by Tibet to the east, and the great mountain ranges in every direction. It is one of the highest inhabited regions on Earth. The air is thin and clear. The sky is a particular shade of blue that you only see at altitude. The landscape is stark and beautiful in a way that is quite unlike anything at lower elevations. Isabella traveled through it on horseback, as she so often did. The horses here were different from the small animals of rural Japan or the mountain horses of Colorado. They were strong, shaggy creatures bred for high altitude work, sturdy and sure-footed on paths that wound along the edges of things that dropped away very steeply. She was not young. She was not in robust health. The altitude affected her, as it affects everyone. Headaches, breathlessness, the sense of effort that attaches to even simple movements at high elevation. But she kept going. She always kept going. From Ladakh, she pushed further into the mountain regions, traveling into territory along the borders of Tibet. The political situation in that part of the world was complicated. Tibet was largely closed to Western travelers. The great powers, Britain and Russia, were engaged in the shadowy competition for influence in Central Asia that historians would later call the Great Game. The borders were sensitive. Movement was not always straightforward. Isabella navigated all of this with a combination of determination and pragmatic flexibility. She went where she could go. When a route was genuinely closed, she found another. She gathered information, observed everything, and wrote it all down in the careful letters that continued to flow homeward. The mountain landscapes affected her deeply. She had always responded to high places. There was something about altitude, about the scale and the silence and the particular quality of light at elevation that suited something in her. She had felt it in Colorado. She felt it again here, more intensely, in mountains that made the Rockies look modest. She wrote about the Himalayan region with a reverence that was quiet and undemonstrative. She didn't reach for grand language or spiritual proclamations. She simply described what she saw, and the description itself conveyed the scale of it. She returned to England in 1890, after more than a year away. She was 58 years old. She had traveled through India, through the high mountain regions of Ladakh, along the borders of Tibet. She had visited mission hospitals and mountain passes and villages at altitudes that most people would never experience. And she had material for another book. The book that emerged from this journey was called Among the Tibetan Borderlands, though it went through some changes in title and form before reaching its final version. It added to her body of work in the steady, accumulating way that her books always had, each one a record of a place and a time, each one adding another layer to the portrait of a woman who simply kept going. Back in Edinburgh, she threw herself into work that she had been building toward for some time. She wanted to establish a memorial to John Bishop, something lasting and useful. She had decided that the most fitting memorial would be a hospital, a place where medical care could be given to people who needed it. She raised money. She organized. She used her name and her reputation and her considerable capacity for determined effort in the service of this goal. The John Bishop Memorial Hospital was established in Srinagar, in Kashmir. A real place, doing real work, in a part of the world she had come to know and care about. It was a significant achievement, and it was one that mattered to her in a particular way, because it connected her love of that mountain region with her grief for her husband and her belief in the value of practical, useful work. But she was not finished traveling. In 1894, Isabella Bird Bishop, as she now sometimes signed herself, departed for another journey. This one would take her further east than she had ever been, into China, and then into Korea, and eventually into the remote and largely unknown interior regions of Western China. She was 62 years old. China in the 1890s was a civilization under enormous pressure. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for more than 2 centuries, was weakening. Foreign powers were pushing at the edges of Chinese sovereignty. The treaty ports, like Shanghai and Canton, were places where Western commercial and political influence had established a strong foothold. Missionary activity was widespread in some regions. Social tensions were building in ways that would eventually erupt into the violence of the Boxer Uprising at the turn of the century. Isabella arrived into this complicated world with her usual combination of curiosity and practical determination. She traveled extensively through China over the course of several visits and journeys in the mid-1890s. She went to places that Western travelers, and Western women in particular, simply did not go. She traveled along the Yangtze River, one of the great rivers of the world, moving deep into the interior of the country. She navigated the rapids of the upper Yangtze, which were genuinely dangerous. The river in those sections ran fast and turbulent through narrow gorges, and the boats that traveled it were handled by crews who understood the water in ways that no guidebook could capture. She traveled through Sichuan province in the southwest of China, a vast region of mountains and river valleys, home to millions of people living in ways that had changed relatively little for centuries. She visited remote towns. She stayed in basic accommodation. She moved through landscapes that were beautiful and strange, and entirely unlike anything in Europe. The reception she received in parts of China was not always welcoming. This was a difficult period in the relationship between China and the Western powers. Resentment of foreign presence was widespread and often justified. Western imperialism in China had not been gentle. The opium trade, the unequal treaties, the concessions extracted by force, the condescension of foreign officials and missionaries who often treated Chinese people and Chinese culture with something between indifference and contempt. Isabella herself was not free of the assumptions of her era. She was a Victorian Englishwoman, and she carried that identity with her, with all its complexities. But she was also genuinely interested in Chinese life and culture in a way that went beyond the superficial. She wanted to understand what she was seeing. She asked questions. She observed carefully. She tried to form her own views rather than simply repeating what other foreigners told her. There were incidents during her Chinese travels that were genuinely alarming. On at least one occasion, a crowd gathered around her in a way that became hostile. Stones were thrown. There was real danger for a period of time. She described these episodes without drama, or rather, with a particular kind of calm that is almost more striking than drama would have been. She recorded what happened. She recorded her own response, which was measured, and she moved on. It was the same quality she had always had. The ability to be in a difficult or frightening situation without being undone by it. To stay present and observant even when things were uncomfortable or uncertain. From China, she traveled to Korea. Korea in the 1890s was caught between competing imperial powers. Japan was expanding its influence aggressively. China had long considered Korea a tributary state. Russia was pressing from the north. And within Korea itself, a traditional society was facing the pressures of a rapidly changing world. Isabella visited Korea on multiple occasions during this period. She traveled through the country with her characteristic desire to go beyond the obvious places, to see the parts of a country that revealed its actual life, rather than its official face. She met Korean people of different social positions. She observed the court. She traveled through the countryside. She wrote about what she saw with the careful honesty that characterized all her best work. Her account of Korea, eventually published as Korea and Her Neighbors in 1898, was considered one of the most significant Western accounts of the country written during that period. She had seen it at a particular historical moment, just before the conflicts that would reshape the entire region. Her observations had a documentary value that went beyond the personal. She also visited the treaty port cities of China's coast, Shanghai, Canton, places where the collision between Chinese tradition and Western commercial power was visible in the very architecture of the streets. She traveled on rivers and on the sea. She rode on horseback and was carried in chairs and walked when there was nothing else to do. She stayed in mission houses and local inns, and occasionally in something approaching genuine comfort, though comfort was never what she was seeking. The books that came out of these years of travel in Asia are among the most substantive of her career. Yangtze Valley and Beyond, published in 1899, described her journeys through the interior of China with a depth and detail that reflected how much she had seen and how carefully she had looked. It was not a casual traveler's account. It was the work of someone who had spent real time in a place and had tried genuinely to understand it. These were serious books, taken seriously by serious people. The Royal Geographical Society, which had been cautious about admitting women to its fellowship, was moving toward a change in its position. Isabella's work was one of the reasons that change was possible. And then, in 1892, it happened. Isabella Bird was elected a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. She was one of the first women to receive that distinction. The first group of women fellows was admitted that year, and Isabella was among them. It was a formal recognition of what her work had represented over the previous decades. The journeys, the books, the careful observation and honest reporting, the willingness to go to places that required real courage and real endurance. There was some controversy about it, as there often is when institutions change in ways that challenge established habits. Some members of the society objected to the admission of women. The debate was real and sometimes heated, but the decision stood, and Isabella, who had never made self-promotion a priority, who had always written about places rather than about her own achievements, received the recognition with her characteristic quietness. By the late 1890s, Isabella was in her mid-60s. She had been traveling seriously for more than 40 years. She had published a substantial body of work. She was recognized and respected in a way that few travel writers of her era, male or female, could match. And she was still not entirely done. She had been to North America, to Hawaii, to the Rocky Mountains, to Australia and New Zealand, to Japan, to India and the Himalayan borderlands, to China and Korea. There was one more major journey still in her. In 1901, Isabella Bird set out for Morocco. She was 69 years old. Morocco was not as remote as Ladakh or as vast as China, but it was a place that Western women did not commonly travel. And it was a place that Isabella approached with the same open curiosity she had brought to every other destination in her long traveling life. She rode on horseback through the Atlas Mountains. She visited towns and villages in the interior. She observed the life of a Muslim country with the same careful attention she had brought to Japan and China and India. She tried to understand rather than simply to judge. The journey produced one of her last books, Journeys in Morocco, published not long after her return. It was a final chapter in a body of travel that had taken her over the course of 40 years across almost every inhabited region of the world. She returned to England from Morocco and began to make plans for yet another journey. There were reports that she was considering a return to China, that she was thinking about Central Asia, that there were more places she wanted to see. She was in her early 70s now, and her health was genuinely failing. Not in the familiar way of her younger years, where the ailments retreated when she started moving. This was something more serious. Her heart was not strong. She had other complaints that were harder to dismiss. But she kept planning. She kept thinking about the next journey. It was simply the way her mind worked. After a lifetime of moving through the world, she died on the 7th of October in 1904. She was 72 years old. She was in Edinburgh, in the city that had never entirely suited her, but that had been her base, her returning point, throughout all the decades of travel. She died quietly, as she had lived in most respects, without drama, without fanfare, and the world she left behind was one she had moved through more thoroughly, more curiously, and more honestly than almost anyone of her generation. There is something worth pausing on when you consider the full shape of Isabella Bird's life. Not the individual journeys, remarkable as each of them was. Not the books, or the fellowship of the Royal Geographical Society, or the hospital she built in Kashmir as a memorial to her husband. Those things are all real and all worth knowing about. But the shape of the whole life, the arc of it. She was born into a world that had very clear ideas about what a woman's life should look like, particularly a woman of her background and class. A clergyman's daughter in early Victorian England. The expectation was a domestic life, a life organized around the home and the family and the church and the small social world of respectable provincial England. And she did live that life, in part. She was not someone who rejected her world wholesale or made rebellion her identity. She cared about the people around her. She maintained her friendships and her family connections with real devotion. She nursed her sister through years of illness. She married late in life and was a genuine and caring wife. But she also, quietly and persistently, and without making a great noise about it, simply went her own way. She went to the Rocky Mountains when she was in her early 40s. She climbed a 14,000-foot peak with a scarred trapper as her guide. She rode astride through the mountains of rural Japan when she was in her late 40s. She traveled into the Himalayan borderlands in her late 50s. She navigated the rapids of the Yangtze River in her early 60s. She rode through the Atlas Mountains of Morocco when she was nearly 70. Each of these things, taken alone, would have been notable. Together, they form a life that is genuinely difficult to categorize. She was not, it should be said, a perfect traveler or a perfect observer. She was a woman of her time, and that meant she carried certain assumptions with her. Assumptions about empire, about civilization, about the relative standing of different cultures. She could be condescending at times in ways that are uncomfortable to read now. She sometimes applied the measuring stick of Victorian English values to people and places that had their own entirely coherent ways of being in the world. This is worth acknowledging. It would be a disservice to Isabella and to the people she wrote about to smooth over these things in the name of making her story simpler or more flattering. But it is also worth noting that she was, by the standards of her time, and often beyond them, unusually willing to look. To actually look at the people and places she encountered, rather than simply confirming what she already thought she knew. She sat with Ainu families in Hokkaido and tried to understand their lives. She walked through Chinese villages in the interior and tried to see the reality of life there, not the version that the treaty port merchants preferred to describe. She rode through the Korean countryside and wrote about what she saw with an honesty that made her account valuable to historians for generations afterward. She was imperfect, and she was genuinely curious. Both things were true, and the second one mattered enormously. Her writing is worth spending a moment on, because it is part of her legacy in its own right. She wrote a great deal. Over the course of her career, she published more than a dozen books. She wrote letters that were themselves substantial literary documents. She contributed to journals and periodicals. She gave lectures. The quality that runs through all of it is a kind of honest clarity. She didn't dress things up. She didn't reach for grand effects or elaborate constructions. She wrote the way she observed, which was carefully and directly, with a preference for the specific over the general. When she described a landscape, you could see it, not because she used the most beautiful language, but because she noticed the right things. The particular quality of light at a certain time of day, the way a path felt underfoot after rain, the sound a river made in a narrow gorge, the expression on a person's face in an unexpected moment. This is the skill of a writer who is also a genuine observer, someone who is interested enough in the world outside herself to actually pay attention to it. Her books were popular during her lifetime. They were read by people who had never traveled to Japan or Colorado or the Tibetan borderlands, and who found in her pages something of what those places felt like. She brought the world home to readers who had no other way of reaching it, and her books are still readable today, not simply as historical documents, though they have that value, but as actual books. You can open A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains or Unbeaten Tracks in Japan and simply read, because the writing has a quality that doesn't date in the way that more ornate Victorian prose often does. There is something particular about the relationship between Isabella's health and her traveling life that deserves a gentle reflection. Throughout her life, the pattern repeated itself with a consistency that was almost mathematical. At home, she was unwell. In motion, she was well. The complaints that confined her to the sofa in Edinburgh dissolved when she got on a ship. The back pain that made indoor life a low-grade misery seemed to ease when she was on horseback on a mountain path. Her doctors noted it. She noted it herself, with a mixture of wry acknowledgement and genuine puzzlement. It was not something she could entirely explain, but it was real, and it shaped her life in the most fundamental way. There is a temptation to read this as purely psychological, the idea that she was simply happier when traveling, and that happiness expressed itself as physical well-being. And there is probably something to that. She was genuinely alive when she was moving through the world in a way that she wasn't when she was sitting still. But it may also have been something more straightforwardly physical. She was active when traveling. She was outdoors. She was in fresh air and natural light. She was using her body in ways that the sedentary indoor life of Victorian respectability did not permit. All of these things have real effects on real bodies. Whatever the explanation, the pattern was undeniable, and it meant that her traveling was not, for Isabella, simply a preference or an indulgence. It was, in some genuine sense, a necessity. Her life when she traveled was a longer and healthier life than her life when she didn't. The Victorian world she moved through was itself a remarkable thing to observe from a distance. She was born in 1831. She died in 1904. In those 72 years, the world changed more rapidly than it had in any comparable period in human history. She was born before the railway age had properly begun in England. She died after the first powered flight had taken place. She was born when letters took weeks to cross the Atlantic by sailing ship. She died in a world where telegraph cables ran under the ocean and messages traveled in hours. The places she visited changed too, in ways that her early visits sometimes let her see before the changes were complete. Hawaii, when she arrived in 1873, was still a kingdom. It became a republic in 1894 and was annexed by the United States in 1898. Japan, when she arrived in 1878, was barely a decade into its modernization. By the time she died in 1904, Japan had fought and won a war against China and was about to fight and win a war against Russia. Korea, which she visited in the 1890s as a nominally independent kingdom, was formally annexed by Japan in 1910, just a few years after her death. She moved through a world in motion, and her books captured, sometimes inadvertently, the last glimpses of ways of life that were about to change forever. This is part of what makes her work valuable beyond the personal story. She was in the right places at the right times, with her eyes open and her pen moving. And what she recorded has a documentary importance that outlasted any individual journey. Her legacy settled quietly into the record over the decades following her death. She was not forgotten exactly. Her books remained in print in various forms. Travelers and historians and geographers referred to her. The Royal Geographical Society acknowledged her place in its history. The hospital she had founded in Kashmir continued its work for many years, but she was also not in the front rank of Victorian celebrity. She had never sought that kind of fame. She had written about places, not about herself. She'd been interested in the world, not in her own story, as a subject of fascination. In the later 20th century, interest in her grew again, as historians and readers began to look more carefully at the lives of women who had lived beyond the conventional boundaries of their era. Isabella's name came up again and again. Here was someone who had done extraordinary things in a world that had not encouraged women to do extraordinary things, who had done them without making a loud claim about it, who had simply gone ahead and done them. New editions of her books appeared. Biographies were written. She was taught in university courses on travel writing and Victorian literature and the history of exploration. She was recognized as a genuinely significant figure, not just a curiosity or an anomaly, but someone whose life and work reveals something real and important about what was possible. It is perhaps worth thinking, gently, about what Isabella's life suggests to us. Not as a lesson exactly. She would probably have been suspicious of being turned into a lesson. She was too practical and too honest for that, but simply as a life, as an example of what one person's life can contain, when that person follows their own nature with persistence and honesty and a willingness to keep going even when things are difficult. She was not a revolutionary. She didn't set out to change what was possible for women, though her life contributed to that change in quiet and real ways. She didn't have a grand ideology or a mission statement. She had curiosity. She had determination. She had a body that felt better outdoors than in, and she had the ability to write about what she saw in a way that other people could share. From those simple materials, she built a life of remarkable scope and substance. She traveled to Japan and Colorado and Hawaii and India and the Himalayan borderlands and China and Korea and Morocco. She wrote books that people read with genuine interest and pleasure. She raised money for a hospital. She was recognized by one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. She married and grieved and kept going. She fell ill and recovered and fell ill again and kept going. She grew old, slowly, and she kept planning the next journey, even when her body was making those plans harder to execute. And she died in Edinburgh, the city that never quite suited her, surrounded by the familiar things of a home she was always leaving. The letters she wrote to Henrietta deserve one final quiet mention, because in many ways, those letters are the heart of everything. The books came from the letters. The books were shaped by the imagined presence of the sister who would read them. The voice that readers recognized in the books, that calm and clear and curious voice, was the voice of a woman writing to her closest companion about the things she was seeing. When Henrietta died in 1880, something shifted in Isabella's writing in a subtle way. The books that followed were no different in quality, but something in the felt presence behind the words was different. She was writing for a wider audience now, because the particular audience of one, the most important audience, was gone. She kept writing. Of course she did. But there is something moving about knowing that so much of what she produced was, at its origin, Simply a woman telling her sister what she had seen that day. The Ainu villages of Hokkaido, the summit of Long's Peak in the cold Colorado air, the rapids of the upper Yangtze, the high blue sky over Ladakh, the tea houses of rural Japan, the mountain paths of Morocco, all of it written down in letters, sent across oceans to Edinburgh, to a quiet woman in a house who read them and saved them, and was, in her own way, travelling too. Tonight, wherever you are, in whatever quiet room you have found yourself in, the world outside is large and various, and full of places that would take a lifetime to see properly. Isabella Bird spent her lifetime trying to see some of them, and she did it with more honesty and more persistence and more genuine curiosity than almost anyone of her era. Her books are still there. The mountains she climbed are still there. The rivers she travelled are still running. The landscapes she described in her careful, clear prose are still, in their essential nature, what they were when she moved through them. She lived a long life, and filled it as fully as her nature allowed. And now the story of that life can settle quietly around you, like the end of a long day. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. Just rest. Let the images of those far places grow soft and distant. The mountain passes. The river valleys. The wide Pacific sky above the Hawaiian Islands. Let them fade gently, one by one, as sleep finds you. Good night.